I'm playing something almost every week, and sometimes I want to talk about it and give you a vertical slice. So stick with me for some lightning reviews. This week on the chopping block. Hi everyone, Happy New Year. I took January off, and now I'm back and rearing to go. That being said, I figured I'd start the year with possibly one of my most anticipated arrivals in years. A piece of hardware that seemingly looks to bridge the conveniences and ease of use of modern gaming consoles with the libraries of the past. A system that I literally had to wait years for. Introducing the Polymega. A retro game console that relies on high-quality emulation to make a whole mess of old games playable out of the box. Which games, you might ask? Well, it advertises the ability to play Sega CD, Sega Saturn, TurboGrafx CD, PC Engine CD, and most of all, original PlayStation games. That's by itself. However, through the use of expansion modules that can be purchased separately, the system further opens up to play NES, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis and 32X, TurboGrafx, and most recently added as an option, Nintendo 64 games. For now, though, let's focus on the system straight out of the box. Opening the packaging, the base Polymega unit feels relatively light but significantly sturdy. Another multi-system console I own, which will also be serving as a base for comparison, the Retron 5, feels rather flimsy, and I've actually broken a plastic shell component once before by putting a cartridge in too forcefully. Anyway, setup is very easy if you intend to play straight out of the box. However, I intended to take advantage of a feature of the Polymega that extended my setup a bit. That feature being an expansion slot so one could install an SSD. Given my excitement and willingness to play as soon as I could, I didn't exactly do a tremendous amount of rigor and research into compatible SSDs, and ended up buying a 1TB GameStop brand for about $100 that was specifically designed to go into a PS5. To reiterate, the Polymega feels sturdy, but when it came to installing my SSD, I'd argue that it was almost a little bit too much so. The mounting screw for the SSD was driven in so tightly that I ended up stripping the screw head and having to get some replacements from a local electronics shop. Additionally, the space for the SSD was tighter than I was expecting, so I ended up having to remove the heatsink that came installed on the drive itself. Finally, when I eventually went to go and try and tighten the mounting screw with the stripped head, the screw had a little bit of difficulty seating properly, and I ended up dropping the screw into the interior of the console and having to pick it up to shake it out. Twice.
God.
But finally I was successful, and this added a terabyte of storage to the system beyond the default 10 gigabytes that it comes with. Optional setup pains aside, once the system was plugged in, the next step, as with any modern console, was to connect it to the internet and update it. This took a while because, to my layman's perspective, it seemed as though it had to apply every single update that has come out in sequence. After about 45 minutes though, I was finally ready to start using the console. Before I go into the details, let me just put up a brief disclaimer as to what to expect from my review akin to the framing I did for my Steam Deck. I review hardware and consoles from the perspective of an average Joe. I don't get into the nitty-gritty of processing speeds or technical specs. I focus on usability, impressions based on observed performance, and perceived value and quality. Now, getting back on track and bringing up the Retron 5 again for comparison, my previous experience was with extremely bare-bones, sometimes clunky user interfaces, with basic text and sometimes almost glaring colors. That being said, the Polymega interface and menus are exceptionally clear and far more inviting. Navigation is easy and straightforward, although a lack of positive response for some menu options in the system settings was a little odd. After messing around with the menus for a minute, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that the system comes installed with a handful of games. From my experience, they are nothing earth-shattering, but it was nonetheless a refreshing thing to find included. Finally, diving into one of the main features of the system that drew me in the first place, I elected to start installing games onto the system itself, mainly some of my expensive titles so that I wouldn't have to go through the anxiety of handling them whenever I wanted to play them. The installation process is simple. You put in the disc, give it a minute to spin up, then you're given the option to either play it or manage aspects of it, at which point, provided there are no imperfections with the disc, the entirety of the ROM will then be kept on the system so you don't have to insert the disc again. It's worth noting that in my collection of PS1, Saturn, and Sega CD titles, which totaled about 185 games, I only had about 3 discs that I ultimately either needed to replace or resurface. I also had an issue with my Sega Saturn copy of Myst, but that will be relevant in a later part of the review. Depending on the data size of each individual disc, it may take 10 minutes to install a game. That being said, I spent almost an entire weekend casually installing my entire disc-based game library, along with all my Nintendo 64 cartridges. It's worth noting that the cartridge installations were significantly more expedient, likely due to the data sizes of old cartridges versus discs. It's worth noting that by the time I finished installing all the games I could, there were a total of 475 games on the system, and I'd only used up about 200 gigs of the terabyte drive. That being said, once all the games were installed, I began to put the system through its paces. Most of my time spent thus far with the system has been with the Nintendo 64 titles, and not without reason. While I may be a layman, I do follow other various YouTubers of a more technical aspect, and the Nintendo 64 amongst those circles is notorious for being rather difficult to emulate, meaning that if there were going to be issues, this is where I was expecting to see that. However, I'm pleased to say that in my playtime, I rarely experienced any issues beyond a potential light stutter. One good illustration is this overhead screen in Mario Kart, which lesser emulators are unable to display or have issues in doing so. But in my rounds of playing Super Smash Bros., Star Wars Episode 1 Pod Racer, and a few other select titles, I was quite pleased with my experience. One other feature of the system, provided you have the system online and access to the database, are that certain games can be started utilizing GameShark-style cheat codes. Definitely something I wasn't expecting, but I absolutely appreciate it as a feature, especially with some games that had a propensity of being grindy that you could rapidly accelerate the pace of in order to get through faster. When I switched over to trying out a few PlayStation 1 games, I decided to pursue a specific avenue of testing for the sake of precision. This is where I broke out some early rhythm games, things like the early Dance Dance Revolution titles or Parappa the Rapper. While the games were perfectly playable, I did encounter one issue that was rather significant to me, but maybe not so many other people. Those familiar with modern displays know that you need to calibrate systems to compensate for lag, but older games didn't have such a feature since most of them were still operating off of CRT displays. Unfortunately, this means that while the games are technically playable, you have to mentally shift your brain forward so that your inputs may no longer match the display or audio. However, provided you're not playing rhythm games, I doubt you'll encounter too many issues because the PlayStation 1 emulation was otherwise quite solid. Now, initially, I'd only ordered the Nintendo 64 module, but recently developments have been taking place at Polymega, so early in January I decided to order the modules for the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and NES, as well as a light gun that theoretically makes those games playable on modern displays. At the time of writing and reviewing, the only thing that hasn't shown up is that light gun. That being said, the Sega Genesis module works fine, and I have no issues really to cover with that one. However, I have a few more things to say about the NES and Super Nintendo modules, so let's move on to those. I started with the Super Nintendo module, and by and large had no issues with ripping the library to the system. The data transfer was almost instantaneous given the data size, and the database ensured I was able to identify most cartridges as soon as they were put in. However, I did have one game that I experienced an issue with, but that was an underlying issue that was shared with a few other NES games as well. Specifically, NES games that could be classified as unofficial, cartridges that never received the official Nintendo seal of approval. Titles like the Tengen cartridges or the Wisdom Tree games. For those who are unfamiliar, all these games were never approved for use on the NES system, so many of them don't appear in the library database for games that can be ripped to the system. They also never received official access to Nintendo proprietary decoding technology, so there's likely an issue when it comes to trying to emulate these titles specifically. Going back to that Super Nintendo title, Super 3D Noah's Ark, another Wisdom Tree game, this one had a particular workaround where you needed to plug in an official Super Nintendo cartridge into the top of the copy of Noah's Ark in order to get it to work. That being said, most of these either didn't work or had major issues being recognized by the system. While unofficial games are somewhat uncommon, when you do come across them, they make for interesting talking pieces, and since the Polymega, as far as I can tell, doesn't really support most of these unofficial games, it does show a minor crack around how desirous it might be for some enthusiasts. Although that could theoretically change in the future. As I've mentioned prior, the system does get updates. One update resolved an issue for my copy of Myst for the Sega Saturn, which I experienced personally. I reached out to Polymega HQ on social media and they responded. A few days later, the issue was resolved, so it's heartening to see the makers actively supporting their console and looking to improvement. From what I understand, they are also making preparations to launch a store where you can download games directly onto your system. Hopefully, they'll also continue to expand the library database to include all those unofficial games I mentioned prior. Going in even further for hopes for desired functionality, I discovered that the system is capable of playing music CDs, which is nice, but unfortunately not DVDs. I also tried the Super Game Boy accessory with the Super Nintendo module in the hopes that I would be able to do some high-end capture for one of my favorite Game Boy titles. No such luck at this time, I'm afraid, but it could be something implemented in a future update. Then again, I'd be appalled if they didn't have some manner of ongoing support and communication going, considering some of the underlying issues that have been taking place in the background for some time now. You see, I ordered my Polymega system a while back. How far back? Well, from the day that I ordered my system to the day that it arrived on my doorstep, it took 2 years, 9 months, and 16 days. Some might rightly think that's appalling, but I digress. They've always been forward in communicating that they're trying to get issues resolved, and all the underlying issues behind it taking so long were supposedly initiated by the COVID pandemic. That being said, I must reiterate that they have seemingly straightened out everything, and are now fulfilling orders in a timely manner for those that are interested. Which I suppose leads me to the final matter, the price. This might be one of the more contentious factors to review, though. For the base model console and a single controller, you'll be shelling out approximately $550. Each additional expansion module also costs approximately $80, and I've bought 4. Oh, and that light gun I mentioned that I'm still waiting on, that's about another $110. My base system was less expensive because I ordered it a while back while it was still about $500, but that being said, I've probably shelled out about $930 in total, not including taxes and shipping, for the system and its various modules, which is incredibly hard to justify when looking at it through certain lenses. However, there is one aspect I want to cover, and this could be a little more than speculation on my part, but this system leaves me excited as theoretically being something of an almost future-proof console concept as far as emulation and retro consoles are concerned. You see, official clone systems usually have to wait for their original hardware patents to wear off, which, unless I'm mistaken, takes about 25 years. Bearing this in mind, a system like this could theoretically receive ongoing support and every few years gain access to another system. The Dreamcast turns 25 in a little over a year, and I'd imagine some people are eagerly looking forward to a retro system that can play those games. Again, this is a bit of speculation, but something that I would be very eager to see develop into reality if at all possible. For now, let's move on to my concluding thoughts. To summarize, I am very fond of my Polymega system, but that does not mean I can blindly praise it though. This system is designed for ease of use and comes with a medley of features to bring retro games into the modern era with minimal effort. The ongoing support of the system, the continuous communication, and software updates from their HQ leave me feeling encouraged by the future of this console, and this is likely going to be a mainstay of my entertainment setup for some time. However, the patience I needed to display in order to receive my system can't help but leave a sour taste in my mouth, even if they've seemingly eliminated the underlying issues for new customers. Finally, the price point of the system and its expansion modules is a tough pill to swallow, and places the system almost exclusively into the niche of an enthusiast's machine that can relatively easily be matched, if not outdone, by a tech-savvy individual with proper hookups to plug old games media into a PC. I want to see this console do well, but I'm not blind to its issues and hurdles. With tax refunds likely being issued relatively soon, a few people might have found something to sink a little bit of spending cash into. If you've got a bunch of old systems and the means to hook them up and play them, I can't in good conscience tell you to replace them with a Polymega system unless you really want to. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a Starfield playthrough to get back to. Hey, look at that, it's the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember that commenting can actually win you a free prize. So until next time, this is Gheeotine saying thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.